The crystal flutes stood in perfect geometric precision, stacked 17 layers high into a tower that caught the light from 100 gas lamps like captured stars. Champagne would cascade down those glasses at the stroke of midnight, bubbling gold transformed into something far more sinister. By the time the clock finished chiming in 1904, 7 members of the Duvall family would be convulsing on imported Persian carpets, their bodies betraying them with every swallow they'd celebrated. This is the story of how Antoine Kabongo, a butler in Belgian Congo's most prestigious household, turned a New Year's Eve tradition into an execution chamber, using nothing more than cassava root extract and 4 years of patient observation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening air hung thick with humidity even as the sun disappeared behind the Congo River, turning the water into molten copper. Antoine stood at the entrance to the grand salon, his white serving jacket pressed to perfection, hands clasped behind his back in the posture of absolute deference that had taken him months to master. The Duvall mansion blazed with light, every window a declaration of European civilization imposed upon the African darkness. Through the French doors leading to the terrace, he could see servants rushing back and forth, preparing for the 40 guests who had arrived by carriage within the hour. Commandant Philippe Duvall's voice boomed from the library, discussing rubber production quotas with his eldest son Laurent. Their laughter carried down the marble hallway, the kind of unguarded mirth that comes from men who've never questioned their right to anything. Antoine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle memory he'd learned to suppress until it became invisible. He'd been perfecting invisibility for 4 years now, ever since the Force Publique soldiers brought him from the mission school in chains, declaring that an educated native was exactly what the commandant needed for his household staff. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall began its evening ritual, 6 heavy chimes that seemed to shake the foundation. Each note reverberated through Antoine's chest like a countdown he'd been measuring not in hours, but in years. In his vest pocket, wrapped in waxed paper no thicker than a playing card, lay the concentrated extract of bitter cassava that Mama and Zola had prepared under moonlight 3 nights ago. The traditional healer had asked him only one question when he came to her compound in the native quarter: how many? When he answered 7, she nodded slowly, adding specific measurements of additional compounds that would accelerate the cyanide's work. The substance carried no scent that European noses would recognize, no taste that champagne bubbles couldn't disguise. Antoine had not always been invisible. There was a time when his name carried weight in his village near Mbadaka, when his wife Naima would greet him at the doorway of their home with their 3 sons tumbling around her legs like puppies. The eldest, Kimbangu, had inherited his father's quick mind and gentle hands. The middle boy, Lufuno, sang while he worked in their small garden, voice rising above the river sounds. The youngest, barely past his 7th year, had been named Eloko, which meant promise. That was before the rubber quotas became impossible, before the Force Publique came with rifles in chains, before the village headman was forced to choose between meeting the weight requirements or watching his people die. They'd killed Naima first when she tried to shield the children. Antoine had been away at the Catholic mission where Father Dubois taught him chemistry and French literature, grooming him for a position as a missionary assistant. He returned to find his home burned, his wife's body displayed as a warning, his sons nowhere to be found until a neighboring woman whispered that they'd been taken into the forest and shot for the crime of having a father who could read. The Force Publique officer who led the raid was a young lieutenant named Laurent Duvall, newly arrived from Brussels and eager to prove his efficiency in collecting the red rubber that fueled King Leopold's fortune. 4 years of service had taught Antoine everything about the Duvall family. He knew that Commandant Philippe took his coffee at precisely 7 each morning, 2 sugars, no cream. He knew that Isabelle Duvall suffered from migraines that kept her in darkened rooms 3 days each month, and that she blamed the African climate for weaknesses that had plagued her since girlhood in Bruges. He knew that Laurent had developed a taste for cruelty that exceeded even colonial standards, that he kept a collection of severed hands in a locked cabinet as trophies from his most productive raids. He knew that Celeste, the daughter, wrote poetry in leather journals she thought no one could access, verses that romanticized the Congo as a savage garden being tamed by Belgian grace. He knew that René, the youngest son who'd arrived just 6 months ago, still had nightmares about the violence he'd witnessed during his first rubber collection expedition, but drank himself past conscience every evening to silence his doubts. He knew that Victor Beaumont, the mining engineer who'd married into the family, had a mistress in the native quarter and a gambling debt that made him desperate for the mineral rights his father-in-law controlled. He knew that Marguerite, Laurent's wife, was 3 months pregnant and terrified of giving birth in a country she called God-forsaken, though Antoine had watched her command the flogging of a housemaid for breaking a teacup. The knowledge had accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, building into something solid enough to stand upon. Antoine had learned to move through rooms as if he were merely a shadow cast by lamplight, present but unnoticed, listening to conversations that white colonials conducted as if Congolese servants were deaf or simple or both. He'd learned which floorboards creaked, which doors could be opened silently, which times of day each family member was predictably alone. He'd learned to read their moods in the set of their shoulders, to anticipate their needs before they spoke them, to become so seamlessly integrated into their comfort that they forgot he possessed thoughts of his own. The other servants had noticed his careful observations but said nothing. There was an understanding among them, unspoken but absolute, that survival sometimes required collective blindness. Amara, the head housemaid who'd lost her daughter to diarrhea after the family physician refused to treat a native child, had watched Antoine's face during Laurent's boasting about a particularly brutal village raid. She'd seen something shift.
Behind his eyes, a decision being made in the space between one breath and the next. That evening, she'd simply touched his arm as they passed in the kitchen corridor, a gesture that conveyed both warning and permission. Old Olongo, who maintained the gardens with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd survived by being essential, had pulled Antoine aside one morning 3 months ago. They'd stood among the imported roses that required constant attention in the tropical heat, and Olongo had spoken in Lingala, words that couldn't be traced back if overheard by suspicious ears. He told Antoine about the traditional knowledge that preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It existed before Europeans arrived with their medicines and their poisons, about plants that could heal or harm depending on intention and dosage. He told him about Mama Nzola, who kept the old ways alive in a compound hidden behind the sprawling native market, and he'd drawn a map in the dirt that disappeared with the next rain. The cassava processing had taken weeks of careful extraction. Bitter cassava, the kind that could kill if prepared incorrectly, grew everywhere in the Congo. The knowledge of how to process it safely was passed down through generations, a survival skill that separated those who understood the land from those who simply exploited it. But Mama Nzola had taught Antoine the reverse of safety. She'd shown him how to concentrate the cyanogen glycosides, how to render them into a form that would survive dilution, how to calculate dosage based on body weight and delivery method. She'd asked for nothing in return except his promise that he would tell the story, that the deaths wouldn't be dismissed as random tragedy or divine punishment, but understood as deliberate justice. Now, as the evening accelerated toward midnight, Antoine moved through his duties with mechanical precision. He supervised the placement of silver serving platters in the dining room, each one polished to mirror brightness. He directed Mamadou and the other footmen in arranging chairs for the guests who would witness the family's champagne toast before joining the celebration themselves. He inspected the champagne tower one final time, counting glasses to ensure the cascade would flow perfectly. The bottles waited in ice buckets, imported Mo and Chandon that had traveled from France specifically for this occasion, a display of wealth and connection that the commandant used to reinforce his status among Leopoldville's colonial elite. The poison waited too, in Antoine's pocket, patient as death itself. He'd chosen cyanide specifically for its speed and its poetry. The Duvalls had built their fortune on rubber extracted through forced labor, with quotas enforced through mutilation and murder. The shikati whips that left permanent scars, the severed hands that served as proof of bullets not wasted on living targets, the burned villages and destroyed families, all of it in service of rubber that eventually became bicycle tires and industrial gaskets in European factories. It seemed appropriate that their ending would come from another plant, another extraction, another substance transformed from natural state into instrument of commerce and death. Guests began arriving at 8, their carriages crunching over the circular gravel drive. Antoine stationed himself at the entrance, accepting silk wraps and leather gloves, directing visitors toward the salon where Isabelle Duvall held court in emerald silk that matched her necklace of Congolese malachite. The women spoke French with refined Brussels accents, discussing the difficulty of finding decent help and the challenges of maintaining European standards in such a primitive environment. The men gathered in clusters, voices rising and falling around topics of mineral rights and labor management, and the troubling rumors circulating in European newspapers about conditions in the Congo Free State. Through it all, Antoine moved like water finding its level, refilling glasses, removing empty plates, existing in the space between visibility and absence. He caught fragments of conversation that would have enraged him once, but now simply confirmed the necessity of what he'd planned. A Belgian banker complained that Leopold's critics in the international press were damaging investment opportunities. A rubber company director joked about the efficiency gains from switching to a quota system based on severed hands rather than actual rubber weights. A merchant's wife wondered whether Congolese children were naturally more docile or if proper discipline could be taught. At 11, the commandant gathered his family in the private study for the traditional pre-midnight toast they'd observed since Laurent was a boy. Antoine had learned about this custom during his first New Year's Eve in service, watching through a crack in the door as Philippe Duvall raised his glass to family and fortune, to the continuation of their name and the expansion of their influence. This year, Marguerite's pregnancy added special significance to the ritual. The family was growing, securing its legacy, planning for generations of Duvalls who would inherit the wealth being extracted from Congolese land and Congolese bodies. Antoine served them brandy in crystal sniffers, watching their faces as they toasted to their future with complete confidence in their invulnerability. Not one of them looked at him directly. Not one of them wondered what thoughts moved behind his carefully neutral expression. They'd grown so accustomed to his service that he'd become furniture, a functional object necessary for comfort, but unworthy of actual attention. This invisibility, which had once burned like humiliation, had become his greatest asset. The ballroom glittered with a violence of light that seemed designed to banish every shadow from the room. Gas lamps lined the walls in sconces shaped like golden lilies, their flames reflected endlessly in the mirrored panels that Commandant Duvall had imported from Paris at catastrophic expense. The effect was meant to evoke Versailles, though the humidity that seeped through every sealed window and the distant sound of drums from across the river reminded everyone that this was not Europe, no matter how desperately they pretended otherwise. Antoine moved along the periphery of the celebration, carrying a silver tray of canapés that no one actually wanted but everyone took to maintain the rhythm of civilized consumption. The champagne tower dominated the center of the room, positioned on a raised platform covered in white linen that cascaded to the floor like a frozen waterfall. 17 layers of crystal flutes formed a geometric pyramid that climbed toward the coffered ceiling. Each glass positioned with mathematical precision so the champagne would flow from the apex down through every level, filling each vessel in sequence as guests watched the spectacle. It was Isabelle Duvall's innovation, copied from a reception she'd attended at the 1889 Exposition Universelle in Paris.
Brussels' royal palace before her marriage to Philippe. She described it to Antoine 3 months ago when she first commanded him to arrange for the glassware to be shipped from France, explaining that the cascades symbolized prosperity flowing from the top of society downward, nourishing all levels in perfect hierarchical order. Antoine had listened with the attentive blankness that was expected of him, nodding at appropriate intervals while his mind calculated trajectories and volumes. The tower would require 30 bottles of champagne to fill completely, poured from the single glass at the summit. The liquid would take approximately 4 minutes to cascade through all 17 layers, during which time the family and their guests would gather in a semicircle to watch the spectacle before Philippe Duvall raised the first toast of 1904. The timing was traditional, immutable, rehearsed in previous years until it had become ritual. Antoine had observed 2 prior New Year's celebrations in the Duvall household, taking mental notes while serving, understanding that patterns this rigid created opportunities for those patient enough to wait. The guests moved through the evening in predictable waves, their conversations following familiar channels. Near the piano, where Marguerite played Chopin with technical proficiency but no soul, a cluster of rubber company officials discussed the newest processing techniques that could extract higher yields from the same amount of raw material. By the terrace doors, their wives examined each other's jewelry with the practiced assessment of women who understood that every gemstone represented someone else's labor, someone else's land, someone else's suffering compressed into portable wealth. The younger men had claimed the billiard room, where cigar smoke hung like storm clouds and their laughter carried the edge of violence, barely contained by evening clothes and social convention. Laurent Duvall held court among this group, describing his latest expedition into the Kassai region, where villages had failed to meet their rubber quotas for 3 consecutive months. His voice carried the enthusiastic energy of someone recounting a sporting triumph rather than a military operation against unarmed civilians. He explained his new efficiency method, calculating the exact number of bullets that should yield a corresponding number of severed hands, creating a mathematical proof of kills that eliminated the possibility of soldiers wasting ammunition on hunting game. The innovation had earned him a commendation from the Force Publique Command, and a bonus calculated as a percentage of the increased rubber production that followed the raid. Antoine passed close enough to this circle to serve fresh drinks, close enough to see Laurent's hands gesture expansively, close enough to notice the ring on his right hand that bore the Duvall family crest. Those hands had pulled the trigger that killed Lufuno, Antoine's middle son, the boy who sang while he worked. The missionary who'd brought the news had been reluctant to provide details, but Antoine had insisted on knowing everything, needing to understand exactly how his children had died. Lufuno had been singing when the soldiers came, some song about the river that he'd learned from his grandmother. The bullet had struck him in the chest while the melody was still forming in his throat. The missionary had wept while telling this story, but Antoine had remained dry-eyed, feeling something inside himself crystallize into a substance harder and colder than any diamond pulled from Congolese soil. In the main salon, Isabelle Duvall presided over a circle of women whose conversation revolved around the increasing difficulty of maintaining European standards so far from civilization. They discussed the incompetence of native servants, the impossibility of finding good French bread, the deteriorating quality of their children's education in colonial schools. One woman, recently arrived from Antwerp, wondered how anyone managed without proper help, by which she meant white servants rather than Congolese ones. Isabelle had laughed, a sound like wind chimes made from broken glass,
and explained that the trick was finding natives who'd been educated by missionaries, who understood European expectations and could translate them for the other servants. She gestured vaguely in Antoine's direction without actually looking at him, citing him as an example of the rare colonial success story. Educated by Catholic fathers, fluent in French, capable of managing an entire household staff with minimal supervision, the other women had murmured appreciation, examining Antoine with the same detached interest they might show toward a well-trained dog, before returning to their complaints about the climate and the insects, and the constant awareness of being surrounded by a native population that outnumbered them thousands to one. This last concern always lurked beneath their other complaints, the unspoken fear that the careful hierarchies they'd constructed might collapse if the Congolese ever recognized their own numerical superiority. The clock in the entrance hall struck 11, and the party's energy began to shift, accelerating toward the midnight ritual that would justify the entire evening's expense and effort. Servants emerged from the kitchen carrying the champagne in ice buckets, 30 bottles whose labels proclaimed their French origin and whose corks bore the seal of a vineyard that predated the Revolution. Mamadou and Terrace began arranging the bottles on a side table near the champagne tower as guests drifted toward the spectacle, forming the customary semicircle that would frame the Duvall family's moment of triumph. Antoine supervised this preparation with visible attention to detail, adjusting bottle positions and inspecting ice levels with the focused concern of someone whose reputation depended on flawless execution. No one questioned his movements around the champagne table. No one wondered why he insisted on personally handling the bottles that would be used for the initial pour. No one noticed when his hand disappeared into his vest pocket for less than 3 seconds, emerging empty while he reached for the first bottle to be uncorked. The waxed paper packet remained in his pocket, lighter now, its contents transferred to the champagne with an efficiency born from weeks of rehearsal in his quarters, using water and empty bottles he'd saved from previous dinners. The concentrated cassava extract dissolved instantly in the champagne, invisible and tasteless in the effervescent liquid. Maman Zola had explained that cyanide bound to the champagne's complex organic compounds in ways that masked its chemical signature, and that the bubbles would help distribute the poison evenly throughout the cascade, ensuring that every glass in the tower would receive a lethal dose.
Volume, accounting for evaporation and foam, adding a margin of safety that guaranteed effectiveness even if some champagne spilled during the pour. The dose was massive, designed not for subtlety but for certainty, calibrated to act within minutes rather than hours. Philippe Duvall called for silence, his voice cutting through the multi-layered conversations like a conductor demanding attention from an orchestra. The guests arranged themselves in their predetermined positions, family members at the center front where they would be most visible, lesser nobility and business associates in supporting roles behind them. The formation resembled a court portrait, everyone positioned according to their rank in the colonial hierarchy that governed every social interaction in Leopoldville. Antoine took his station beside the champagne table, one hand resting lightly on the first bottle to be opened, his face composed in an expression of attentive readiness. The commandant began his annual speech, the same basic structure he'd delivered in previous years, but updated with contemporary references that demonstrated his awareness of current events and their implications for colonial prosperity. He spoke of King Leopold's vision for the Congo Free State, of the civilizing mission that justified Belgium's presence in Africa, of the economic opportunities that rewarded those brave enough to build lives in challenging territories. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, each sentence constructed to reinforce the natural rightness of Belgian dominance over Congolese resources and Congolese bodies. Laurent stood beside his father, chest expanded with the pride of someone who saw himself as heir to an empire rather than overseer of systematic theft and murder.
Beside him, Marguerite rested one hand on her barely visible pregnancy, a gesture that declared continuity and future generations of Duvalls who would inherit what their predecessors had stolen. René shifted uncomfortably in his formal clothes, his face flushed from the evening's drinking, but his eyes carrying a discomfort he couldn't quite suppress. Celeste and Victor completed the family tableau, she in yellow silk that made her look younger than her 28 years, he with the distracted expression of someone calculating numbers that had nothing to do with the celebration around him. Isabelle Duvall stood slightly apart from her husband, close enough to demonstrate unity, but far enough to maintain her own sphere of influence. Her emerald necklace caught the gaslight and threw green reflections across the white walls, tiny fragments of color that danced like spirits at a ceremony they hadn't been invited to attend. She wore her authority comfortably, the confidence of a woman who'd managed to transplant European domesticity into African soil through sheer force of will and abundant servant labor. Her household ran with clockwork precision because she'd learned to treat Congolese workers as interchangeable parts in a machine designed for her comfort, replacing anyone who broke or failed to perform at acceptable levels. The commandant concluded his speech with a toast to the new year, to King Leopold, to Belgian courage and Congolese resources combining to create unprecedented prosperity. The guests murmured approval, raising their glasses and practiced synchronization. Philippe signaled Antoine with a slight nod, the gesture casual but absolute, the kind of command that required no words because the hierarchy was so firmly established that obedience could be assumed. Antoine stepped forward, picked up the first champagne bottle, and began removing the wire cage that secured the cork. The sound of the cage unwinding seemed impossibly loud in the sudden, attentive silence. 47 people watched as Antoine manipulated the wire with practiced efficiency, setting it aside and gripping the cork with a linen napkin that would muffle the pop and catch any overflow. He'd opened hundreds of champagne bottles during his 4 years of service, the gesture so familiar that his hands performed it automatically while his mind focused on other calculations. The cork came free with a satisfying pressure release, a small plume of vapor escaping into the warm air. Champagne foamed briefly at the bottle's mouth before settling into readiness. The apex glass waited at the tower's summit, a single flute positioned to receive the initial pour. Antoine climbed the 3 steps that brought him level with the top tier, acutely aware of every eye tracking his movement. This was theater as much as service, the performance of colonial order where even the serving of wine became spectacle. He tipped the bottle slowly, letting champagne flow into the glass with controlled precision, watching as the golden liquid filled the vessel and began to overflow, cascading down to the second tier where 2 glasses waited to catch the flow. The physics of it were beautiful in an abstract way, gravity and surface tension combining to create the illusion of controlled chaos. Champagne flowed from one tier to the next, filling glasses in sequence, the sound of liquid against crystal creating a delicate percussion that accompanied the visual spectacle. Antoine descended the steps and opened the second bottle, then the third, maintaining the steady pour that kept the cascade flowing. Other servants stood ready with additional bottles, but by custom, Antoine handled the initial filling, while the family and their guests watched the tower transform from empty crystal into a glittering monument to excess. 4 minutes and 17 seconds after the first pour began, every glass in the tower held champagne. The cascade slowed to a steady drip, the final drops falling from the lowest tier into a silver basin positioned to catch the overflow. Philippe Duvall stepped forward to claim the apex glass, the symbolic first drink that he would raise before his family and guests joined the toast. His fingers wrapped around the crystal stem with the casual possession of someone who'd never questioned his right to the finest of anything. Isabelle took the second glass from the tier below her husband. Laurent and Marguerite claimed the next level, followed by Celeste and Victor, and finally René, who took his glass with a slight uneasiness that suggested he'd already consumed more alcohol than was wise. The 7 members of the Duvall family stood in their hierarchical formation, crystal flutes raised toward the ceiling, liquid gold catching and reflecting the gaslight until each glass seemed to contain captured fire. The guests arranged below them held empty hands, waiting for their turn to be served once the family completed their ritual. This was the peak of the evening's performance, the moment when colonial order was most visible and most vulnerable, though no one in the room except Antoine understood that vulnerability as anything more than theatrical tension.
Philippe raised his glass higher, preparing to deliver the actual toast that would signal everyone to drink. His voice filled the room once more, speaking words about prosperity and continuity and the divine favor that blessed those strong enough to seize opportunities in untamed lands. His children raised their glasses in mirror of his gesture, 7 crystal flutes lifted in perfect unison, 7 vessels containing death disguised as celebration. The cyanide waited in molecular suspension, tasteless and invisible, ready to transform a moment of triumph into something else entirely. Antoine stepped back into his customary position against the wall, hands clasped behind his back, face composed in neutral attention. Around him, other servants maintained their stations, ready to spring into action once the family finished drinking and the general celebration began. Amara stood near the kitchen door, her eyes meeting Antoine's for a fraction of a second before sliding away, a flicker of understanding passing between them too quick for anyone else to catch. Old Elongo had positioned himself near the terrace exit, casual and unremarkable, exactly where he needed to be. Bosco waited by the main entrance, his missing hand hidden as always in the loose sleeve of his servant's jacket, his face expressionless. The guests began a countdown, voices rising in French as they marked the final seconds before midnight. 10, 9, 8. The numbers fell like stones into water, each one bringing them closer to the moment when everything would change. 7, 6, 5. Philippe's glass tilted toward his lips, champagne already touching the crystal rim. 4, 3, 2. The other family members mirrored his movement in practiced synchronization, the choreography of privilege they'd rehearsed their entire lives. 1. The clock in the entrance hall began to chime midnight, 12 deep strokes that would mark the transition from one year to the next. On the first chime, Philippe Duvall drank, champagne sliding past his lips in a golden stream. On the second chime, his wife followed, then Laurent and Marguerite together on the third. Celeste and Victor drank on the fourth and fifth chimes respectively, and René, slightly delayed by his earlier consumption, swallowed his champagne on the seventh chime. By the time the clock finished its announcement of 1904, 7 members of the Duvall family had consumed approximately 4 ounces of champagne each, along with enough concentrated cyanide to kill 30 people. For approximately 90 seconds, nothing happened. The family lowered their glasses, smiling at each other and at the assembled guests who began applauding the completion of the ritual. Servants moved forward to distribute champagne to the waiting crowd, opening fresh bottles from the table where Antoine had carefully separated the poisoned stock from the safe supply. The party resumed its momentum, conversations restarting, laughter rising, the normal sounds of celebration that masked the chemical reactions beginning to accelerate in 7 bloodstreams.
Cyanide works by binding to iron in the cytochrome C oxidase enzyme, effectively preventing cells from using oxygen even as the lungs continue to breathe and the heart continues to pump oxygenated blood through the body. It's a suffocation that happens at the cellular level, invisible and irreversible once enough of the poison saturates the system. The concentrated dose that Mama Anzola had prepared acted faster than normal, designed to overwhelm the body's natural defenses before any countermeasures could be attempted. The first symptoms would be subtle, easily attributed to the champagne or the heat or simple coincidence. Philippe Duvall lowered himself into a chair, one hand rising to his collar as if the formal attire had suddenly become too tight. Across the room, Laurent set down his empty glass with more force than necessary, the crystal striking the marble tabletop with a sound like a small bell. Isabelle touched her temple, her face contracting in the expression she wore when one of her migraines began, though this pain was different, sharper, accompanied by a sensation like her thoughts were moving through water. Marguerite swayed slightly, catching herself against her husband's arm, laughing as if she'd simply had too much to drink, though this was only her second glass of the evening. René turned toward the terrace doors, seeking cooler air, but his legs betrayed him mid-stride, buckling in a way that sent him stumbling against a side table. The decorative vase displayed there toppled and shattered, crystal fragments scattering across imported tile in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. The sound cut through the party noise, creating a moment of startled attention that revealed Celeste doubled over near the champagne tower, one hand pressed to her stomach, her yellow dress suddenly too bright against her face, which had gone the color of old paper. Victor Beaumont tried to reach his wife, but found his vision narrowing, the room collapsing into a tunnel that grew smaller with each heartbeat. He grabbed for the back of a chair and missed, his spatial awareness failing as oxygen starvation affected his brain's ability to process sensory information. He struck the floor hard, his head connecting with marble in a way that produced a sound like a melon splitting, blood immediately pooling beneath his skull. The guests near him stepped back instinctively, creating a circle of space around his convulsing body. Somewhere in the confusion, someone screamed. The sound seemed to release permission for chaos, and suddenly the ballroom erupted into motion without direction. Guests pressed toward the family, then away from them, uncertain whether proximity meant help or danger. Servants rushed forward, then froze, equally uncertain of their role in this unprecedented collapse of order. The commandant tried to stand, to impose his authority on the situation, but his legs refused the command, and he pitched forward instead, striking his forehead against the arm of his chair before sliding to the floor in a heap of formal clothing and failing dignity. Antoine remained exactly where he'd been standing, his expression shifting from neutral attention to appropriate concern. But his body language suggested someone waiting for instructions rather than someone prepared to act. Other servants looked to him for guidance as they always did in moments of household crisis. But he offered nothing, his face projecting the same confusion they felt. Amara moved toward Isabelle, who had collapsed across a settee, but her movements were slow, deliberate, each step taking longer than necessary. Old Delongo had already disappeared through the terrace exit, melting into the night like smoke dispersing. Laurent thrashed on the floor near the champagne tower, his body convulsing with increasing violence. Foam gathered at the corners of his mouth, pink-tinged from where he'd bitten through his tongue. His hands clawed at his throat as if he could choke the invisible hands that were tightening inside him.
Physically tear away the obstruction that was killing him, but the enemy was chemical, molecular, already integrated into every cell of his body. His eyes found Antoine across the room, and for perhaps the first time in 4 years of service, Laurent actually looked at his butler rather than through him. Some recognition sparked in his oxygen-starved brain, some final understanding blooming too late to matter.
Marguerite had stopped moving, her body curled on its side near her husband, one hand still extended toward him, as if she died reaching for help that never came. The pregnancy that had been announced with such pride just hours earlier would never reach term. The future generation of Duvalls ending before it began. Her face held an expression of profound surprise, as if the possibility of her own death had never occurred to her, despite living in a land where death surrounded them constantly, visible in every forced labor camp and every village razed for failing to meet rubber quotas. The party guests pressed toward the doors, self-preservation overwhelming whatever social obligations had brought them to the Duvall mansion. They fled in clusters, evening clothes and dignified manners abandoned in favor of escape from whatever plague or poison or divine judgment had struck the family. Their carriages departed in chaotic sequence, drivers whipping horses into panicked gallops, wheels throwing gravel against the mansion's walls like accusations. Within minutes, the ballroom that had held 47 people contained only the Duvall family dying on the floor and the 23 Congolese servants who watched with varying degrees of shock, satisfaction, and carefully maintained neutrality. Isabelle Duvall died with her eyes open, staring at the mirrored ceiling where her own reflection multiplied into infinite versions of herself, all of them dying in perfect synchronization. René went next, his body giving up without the fight his older siblings maintained, as if some part of him welcomed the ending. Celeste lasted longer, her breathing growing shallower but persistent, until finally even that stopped, and she lay motionless in her yellow silk that would never be worn again. The commandant held on longest, perhaps his authority extending even to his body's surrender to death, but eventually even he stilled, his hand still clutching the crystal flute that had delivered his ending. 7 members of the Duvall family lay dead on imported carpets, while the grandfather clock continued its steady marking of time, indifferent to the body's cooling in its vicinity. The gas lamps burned with unchanged brilliance, throwing light over a scene that resembled a battlefield more than a ballroom. Broken crystal glittered among the bodies, champagne pooling on marble where dropped glasses had spilled their contents. The tower stood intact at the room's center, a monument to the gravity that pulls everything downward eventually, whether liquid or empire or the illusion of permanence. Antoine finally moved from his position against the wall, crossing the room to stand before the champagne tower. He reached for the apex glass that Philippe Duvall had drunk from, lifting it carefully and examining the crystal in the gaslight. A single drop of champagne remained at the bottom, golden as stolen wealth, poisoned as the system that had brought these people to the Congo and kept them here long enough to die. He poured the drop onto the floor, where it disappeared into the Persian carpet's intricate patterns, absorbed and erased as if it had never existed. The silence that followed 7 deaths felt heavier than the humidity pressing against every window. 23 Congolese servants stood frozen throughout the ballroom, suspended between catastrophe and whatever would come next. The gas lamps burned steadily, indifferent to bodies sprawled across imported carpets, indifferent to shattered crystal catching and scattering light. Outside, the Congo River moved in its ancient rhythm, patient and unstoppable as history itself. Terrace broke first, her carefully maintained composure crumbling as she sank to her knees near Celeste's body. The sound that emerged from her throat wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a scream, something between grief and release that had been building for years of forced silence. Her hands reached toward the yellow silk dress, then pulled back, uncertain whether touching the dead required permission even now. Mamadou moved to help her stand, his own face cycling through shock and fear, and something that might have been satisfaction if examined too closely. Antoine walked among the bodies with methodical attention, pressing fingers to necks, checking for pulses that had already stopped. The gesture established for anyone watching that he was fulfilling his duty as head of household staff, ensuring that nothing could be done before accepting that nothing needed to be done. His face maintained appropriate concern, while his mind calculated the hours ahead, the questions that would come, the story that needed to hold together under scrutiny far more intense than anything they'd faced before. The commandant's study held a telephone, one of only 47 such devices in all of Leopoldville, a symbol of Belgian technological superiority and administrative efficiency. Antoine lifted the heavy receiver and spoke to the night operator in French that carried no accent, nothing to mark him as anything other than a trusted household employee reporting an emergency. The words came smoothly, rehearsed in his mind during months of planning, but delivered now with breathless urgency that sounded genuine. Inspector Georges Mercier arrived 43 minutes later, his carriage accompanied by 2 force publique soldiers who took positions at the mansion's main entrance with rifles held at attention. Mercier was a career colonial administrator who'd spent 19 years in the Congo, rising through ranks by demonstrating absolute loyalty to King Leopold's vision and absolute ruthlessness toward anything that threatened Belgian interests. He wore his authority like his uniform, precisely fitted and impossible to ignore, every button and crease declaring that he represented order imposed on chaos through superior European discipline. He walked into the ballroom and stopped 3 steps inside the doorway. His eyes tracked across the scene with systematic attention. 7 bodies arranged in rough proximity to each other, but not quite together, suggesting they'd collapsed where they stood rather than being moved. Crystal fragments scattered across a wide area, indicating multiple glasses had been dropped or thrown. The champagne tower still standing intact, an island of order in surrounding catastrophe. The servants positioned against walls, separate from the dead, their faces showing appropriate distress, but their bodies maintaining careful distance. Mercier walked to the nearest body, which happened to be Laurent Duvall, and crouched beside it with the efficiency of a hunter examining prey.
Of someone who had examined death many times before. He noted the foam at the mouth corners, the cherry-red flush that suffused the skin despite the hours that had passed since breathing stopped, the way the hands were locked in clawed positions as if trying to tear at something invisible. He stood and moved to the next body, repeating his examination, building a catalog of similarities that would point toward conclusion rather than coincidence. Dr. Henri Rousseau arrived as Mercier completed his initial assessment, medical bag in hand, and expressions suggesting he'd been roused from sleep, though his clothing showed no signs of hasty dressing. Rousseau had trained at the Sorbonne before accepting a position in the Colonial Medical Service, drawn by promises of tropical disease research and the opportunity to build a reputation studying illnesses that European physicians rarely encountered. He knelt beside Isabelle Duvall's body and began an examination that combined clinical detachment with the kind of fascination that suggested he viewed this tragedy as intellectually stimulating rather than humanly devastating. The cherry-red skin tone caught his attention immediately, a classic presentation that any physician with toxicology training would recognize. He pulled back an eyelid and examined the pupil, noted the absence of rigor mortis despite the hours that had passed, observed the way the body had released its contents in the final moments as muscles lost all control. He stood and addressed Mercier with the confidence of someone delivering a diagnosis he'd confirmed even before checking the other bodies. Cyanide poisoning, almost certainly, based on the presentation and the speed of death. The entire family showing identical symptoms suggested a common source, most likely the champagne, given the timeline Antoine had described. Mercier's expression hardened into something that resembled carved stone, all humanity erased in favor of administrative efficiency. He ordered the force publique soldiers to secure the ballroom, allowing no one to enter or exit until a complete investigation could be conducted. He commanded Antoine to gather all servants in the main salon where they could be questioned individually, their statements compared and cross-referenced for inconsistencies. He dispatched one of the soldiers to the Colonial Administration Building with orders to wake Lieutenant Jan Vermeer, the military investigator who specialized in cases involving potential native insurrection or threats to Belgian authority. The servants assembled in the salon with the exhausted compliance of people who understood that resistance would only invite suspicion. They arranged themselves along the walls, maintaining the spatial hierarchy that governed their working relationships even in this moment of collective uncertainty. Amara stood nearest the doorway, her posture erect and her face composed despite the trembling in her hands that she couldn't quite control.
Bosco positioned himself near the windows, his missing hand clearly visible now that he'd abandoned the careful positioning that usually concealed it. Old Alongo had returned from wherever he'd disappeared to during the initial chaos, settling into a chair with the calm of someone whose age granted him permission to sit while others stood. Mercier began his interrogation with Antoine, pulling him into the commandant's study for privacy that felt more like isolation. The questions came methodical and relentless, circling back to details already covered, looking for variations in response that would indicate deception. Who had access to the champagne before it was served? Had Antoine noticed anyone behaving suspiciously during the evening? Were there servants who'd been disciplined recently, who might harbor resentment toward the family? Had Antoine himself experienced any conflicts with the Duvalls that might suggest motive? Antoine answered each question with the patience of someone who'd anticipated this interrogation and prepared accordingly. He described the champagne delivery 3 days prior, how the bottles had been stored in the locked wine cellar that only he and the commandant could access. He explained his supervision of the evening's preparations, how multiple servants had handled the bottles during transport from cellar to ballroom, but always under his direct observation. He acknowledged that household discipline sometimes created temporary tensions, but insisted that the Duvall family treated their servants fairly by colonial standards, that he'd never witnessed or heard of any servant expressing violent intentions. The study of his face while he spoke revealed nothing useful to Mercier, who'd built a career on reading deception in the expressions of people trying to hide guilt. Antoine's face showed appropriate distress, appropriate confusion, appropriate concern about being questioned as if he might be suspected. His hands remained steady, his voice never wavered, his eyes met Mercier's directly without the evasiveness that usually indicated lying. He presented as exactly what he claimed to be, a loyal servant devastated by the loss of a family he'd served with dedication for 4 years, confused about how such tragedy could occur under his supervision. Mercier moved on to questioning other servants, pulling them individually into the study, where the commandant's presence still lingered in the smell of pipe tobacco and leather-bound books. Amara described her duties preparing the ballroom, how she'd arranged flowers and polished silver under Antoine's direction. Mamadou explained his role serving canapés to guests, how he'd witnessed the family's collapse but had been too shocked to act immediately. Terrace detailed her kitchen responsibilities, confirming that multiple people had handled the champagne but that Antoine had personally supervised the bottles used for the tower. Each statement reinforced the others, building a narrative that was consistent without being suspiciously identical. The servants described events from their individual perspectives, adding small details that varied based on where they'd been standing and what they'd been doing, but the core timeline remained stable. The champagne had been properly stored, properly handled, properly served. No one had noticed anything unusual about the bottles or the liquid inside them. The family had drunk from the tower and collapsed minutes later, while champagne from fresh bottles served to guests caused no similar effects. By the time dawn began lightening the sky outside the ballroom, Mercier had questioned all 23 servants and found nothing that contradicted Antoine's account or suggested deliberate poisoning by household staff. The investigation shifted instead toward the champagne, the possibility of contamination during transport from France or storage in Leopoldisville's heat and humidity. Rousseau suggested that cyanide compounds could form naturally in certain conditions, though he admitted it was rare, especially for champagne.
Admitted this was rare and poorly understood. Additional tests on unopened bottles from the same shipment showed no contamination, suggesting the poison had been added after the champagne arrived at the estate but before it was served. This narrowed the opportunity window and increased suspicion toward household staff who'd had access to the bottles between cellar storage and ballroom service. Mercier assembled all servants in the salon once more and delivered this information with the calculated precision of someone hoping to provoke reaction. He watched faces for signs of guilt or fear, studied body language for tells that indicated deception, listened to the quality of silence that followed his announcement. The servants returned his attention with the blank neutrality they'd perfected through years of being observed by people who viewed them as potentially dangerous,
inherently untrustworthy, capable of violence that required constant surveillance to prevent. Antoine maintained his position against the wall, hands clasped behind his back, face showing appropriate concern about implications for household security and his own professional reputation. His breathing remained steady, his pulse invisible, his expression carrying nothing that suggested personal involvement beyond the natural distress of someone whose oversight had failed to prevent tragedy. When Mercier asked him directly whether he had any explanation for how poison could have entered the champagne under his supervision, Antoine replied that he could only assume someone had accessed the wine cellar during the evening while he was occupied with serving guests, though he couldn't imagine who would have done such a thing or why. The investigation stalled there, caught between chemical proof that the champagne had been poisoned and complete absence of evidence pointing toward any specific perpetrator. Vermeer pushed for mass interrogations using enhanced techniques that the force publique employed when dealing with native resistance, but Mercier overruled him, arguing that torturing servants wouldn't produce reliable confessions and would only damage the estate's value by rendering the staff unusable for future employment. After 2 weeks of investigation that consumed significant resources and produced minimal results, Mercier filed his official report concluding that persons unknown had poisoned the Duvall family through deliberate contamination of champagne served at their New Year's Eve celebration. The report noted that household servants remained under suspicion, but that insufficient evidence existed to charge any specific individual with the murders. It recommended continued surveillance of the Congolese staff and suggested that future colonial households implement stricter controls over food and beverage preparation to prevent similar incidents. The report became classified documentation, buried in colonial administration files, where it would remain unexamined for decades. The official public statement described the deaths as tragic accident resulting from accidental contamination, perhaps during transport from France or storage in tropical conditions. This version protected Belgian prestige by avoiding acknowledgement that colonial authority could be successfully challenged by the very people it claimed to have civilized and controlled. The Duvall estate was sold 3 months later to a rubber company consortium that converted the mansion into administrative offices and dismissed most of the household staff. Antoine received a reference letter praising his professional competence and loyalty, written by the trustee who'd never quite trusted him but couldn't identify specific grounds for refusing the documentation. The letter granted him access to employment with other colonial families, allowing him to continue moving through Belgian households with the invisible presence that had served him so effectively. He accepted a position with the Mercier family, working for Inspector Georges Mercier, who'd investigated the Duvall murders without ever suspecting that the butler he'd questioned so thoroughly had orchestrated the very crime he'd been assigned to solve. The irony wasn't lost on Antoine, who understood that sometimes the safest place to hide was in plain sight, working for the man who'd been searching for you without ever really seeing who you were or what you were capable of accomplishing through patience, planning, and the systematic exploitation of the invisibility that colonialism imposed on the colonized. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.